Today we will be looking at Unit 5.8, Mobilizing for War. Mobilizing means getting ready, moving, getting supplied, and in a position to fight the Civil War. Today's key questions: what impacts do industrialization, technology, and U.S. growth have on warfare in the Civil War? What are the goals of the USA and the CSA, and what are the advantages of each? As a review, secession is leaving the Union. The Lower South had seceded after the election of Lincoln in late 1860. Lincoln refused to acknowledge that. We see shots fired at Fort Sumter and that federal fort in the Charleston Harbor taken by South Carolina troops. With lines drawn, we proceed to both sides preparing to fight a war. Traditionally, warfare in this period had been infantry and particularly cavalry. Cavalry is your soldiers on horseback. This would have been your more elite fighters. You had to have the wealth to own a horse in order to do this, own and take care of a horse. But a very important part of warfare throughout the wars we've talked about in this course. We also have technology of muskets moving toward rifles. We've talked about rifling with the Revolutionary War, that it would have spirals that make the bullet spin so that it goes more like a spiral thrown football, where a musket ball goes more like a shot put. And because of the muskets and the infantry, etc., the way we think with the Revolutionary War, with both sides lining up in these formations and marching toward each other, would have been the type of warfare everyone was experienced with coming into the Civil War. That will not always remain the type of war there. It will change throughout the Civil War. Industrialization is going to have a lot of impacts on warfare. Some of those impacts include the growth of railroads. This is going to make it much, much faster to transport goods, people, information. Everything is going to move faster over great distances. It's also important to keep in mind the North is going to have substantially more railroads in place than the South. We also have technology of the telegraph. This is going to make communication instantaneous across long distances, as long as you're connected by the infrastructure of that telegraph line. Again, keeping in mind rural southern areas are going to have limited infrastructure. We also have mass production and interchangeable parts. We talked about this with Eli Whitney and the Industrial Revolution, and how this started with guns and the ability of interchangeable parts to make it much easier to fix weapons, to produce weapons in the first place, and to keep weapons in every soldier's hands. This will also be true of food. It'll be true of blankets, uniforms. Right? Factories are making things. That means we can make more. That means we can supply more soldiers. Okay? And another element of industrialization is just the economy. The United States has become a market economy. Buying, selling, trading. The South is dependent on trading their cotton for other goods. The North needs cotton, needs the South to buy their goods. And so trade, or hurting the enemy's trade, is going to be a major tactic of war. Some other new technology is specific to warfare. Technology of industrialization, but technology of warfare. We have things like the submarine emerging, most famously the Confederacy's Hunley. If you look at the picture to the right, you can see these were very, very small, confined spaces, very dangerous early technology. We also had armored ships. Sorry, it's not a very good picture there. These were called Ironsides because there's metal on them. You had the USS Monitor would be an example of that. And obviously they're going to be better at defending themselves against gunfire, cannon fire, etc. than a wooden-hulled ship. And lastly, we have hot air balloons. Again, you can notice that in the picture here. Please note, this would have been for seeing what's going on. Observation, reconnaissance, spying. You wouldn't be attacking anyone from these balloons. Another new element in the United States was our growth of our population and the size of our government. With an increase in U.S. population, we can have a much larger army. More people means more men eligible to fight in the military. And with this, we will also have a draft or a conscription. A draft is your involuntary military service, when the government forces you to serve in the military. Both the Confederacy and the Union will implement a draft in the Civil War. We not only see an increase in the number of people in the United States, we've seen an increase in the power of that government. From the days of George Washington and John Adams, we've seen an expansion of government's power. Things like buying the Louisiana Purchase, creating a national bank, monitoring the expansion, right? Some of those that will particularly develop in the Civil War are taxation. We will see increased taxation, particularly in income tax, that will begin in this period. We'll have the draft, as we mentioned. And again, it's hard to find something that is a bigger government power than the ability to force you to fight and risk your life in the military. And lastly, we'll see limits on civil liberties during the wartime, particularly the rights of the accused and how people are treated. And we'll talk about those further. So how do these things change wars? In some ways, in the Civil War, we adapt well to a lot of these changes. We are going to use the railroad and telegraph communications and transportation very effectively. We're going to use mass producing to both sides' advantage. But again, remember, the factories are almost exclusively in the North. So the North will benefit much more from mass production of their supplies and weapons. We're going to see increased taxation and the use of the draft. And we'll also see something called total war. Total war is a concept we'll talk about in a lot more detail further in this unit. But just know, as a concept, we're going to change the players in war. We're going to move from war just being about the two sides' military and expand it to being about the general population, the government, more propaganda, all sorts of things like that. In other ways, right, we're slow to adapt. How do we best use mass production? How do we best use these new weapons like submarines or Ironsides or rifles? What can government power do and what should it not do? And particularly the idea of tactics and strategies. We may have a lot of new military tech, a lot of more numbers, but how do we use that? It's going to be a while before we see our sides abandon the cavalry tactics, the lining up in formations and facing off. And that really won't even happen in the Civil War. The Civil War, it's almost like we're experimenting, we're testing out a lot of the new technology, and we haven't really figured out strategically and tactically how to best use it in modern warfare. And keep in mind, we'll talk about this at the end of the unit, but all these changes will affect the results and impacts of the war as well. The amount of devastation, the number of people involved, things like that will be impacted. Not just mobilization and fighting the war, but the impacts as well. So, let's change directions and talk a little bit about goals. The Confederacy and the Union have very different goals going into the war. The Union has one main goal. This is particularly from Lincoln. Preserve the Union. Keep the country together as one. Remember, we've talked about how Lincoln does not recognize the South has any right to secede, so he does not legally consider them separated from the United States. And so they have to fight to try to keep the country together. Over the course of the war, we're going to develop another very important goal, and that is a unified nation, but a unified nation with no slavery. Slavery is going to become more and more of a component of the war for the Union as the war goes on. The Confederacy has a very simple goal as well, to be independent, to win this revolution, to attain their own independence. And I want you to think about how different these goals make life for the North and the South. The Confederacy is very similar to the colonies in the Revolutionary War in that they really only have to defend themselves. They've declared their independence. They don't have to go on the offensive. They don't have to invade the United States. They don't have to even really defeat the United States. They really just have to stay in the fight, keep fighting, and hope that the Union gets tired of fighting and lets them go. Again, much the way the British did. Fine, you want to be your own country? It's not worth it. Go ahead. And so that's a very different strategy from the United States. The United States must dominate the Confederacy. They can't just wait it out. It can't be a draw. They must win and win decisively because they have to win enough that they can force the southern states back into the Union and force them to stay in the Union. So there are very, very different issues at hand based on these goals. In order to preserve the Union, the northern forces, the United States forces, need a significant victory. So let's look at the advantages and disadvantages of each side. The Union has several large advantages. One, they have the majority of the population, right? That means more soldiers, more people working in factories. They have more of the railroads. That makes their mobilization much easier. They have more of the industry. If you look, 80% of the industry in the United States. So it's much simpler for them to supply their troops and the civilians at home. They have pretty much the heart of the financial industry as well, so the money. They have more money in general, in large part because the wealth of the factories. And they have a strong, functioning central government. Remember, the Confederacy just established a government. It's purposefully a weak government. The states are stronger. And that's great as a Confederacy. However, it's very hard to fight a war without a strong, stable government. So that's a huge advantage the Union has. On the Confederate side, by far their biggest advantage is that they're defending their homes. And there's several components to this. It means the Confederate soldiers are going to have a lot more morale and sense of cause than will many of the Union soldiers. It also means Confederate soldiers will know the terrain. They'll know the geography of where they're fighting much better. And lastly, the major advantage of defending your home is what we talked about with our goals just a few minutes ago. That they don't have to win. They don't have to have an invasion. They don't have to have a big victory. They just have to defend themselves and not give up. The other advantage a lot of historians and military professionals see the Confederacy having in the Civil War was on military leadership. They have a lot of top commanders, guys like Robert E. Lee and others who will come to the forefront. A lot of them had leadership experience in the Mexican War. But if you note in parentheses I put early on, the longer the war goes on, the less of an advantage that is going to be. The Union is going to have emerged and developed strong leaders as well. So a year or two into the war, the Confederacy will have lost some of its top leaders in battle, but also the North will have developed some of those leaders, guys like Ulysses S. Grant, who will emerge toward the forefront. So today we're going to work on our Civil War project as our classwork. So as you're done, please proceed to working on that project, whichever step, and begin working on whichever step is appropriate for you. Remember, your directions are in video form. So if you have forgot what you're supposed to do for something, remember you can go back and look at that video. And also on my webpage, under the page that is research projects, you can look back at how to do source cards, note cards. All of that stuff is available to you online because we've already talked about it. Thanks and good luck.